Hello, my name is Joshua Cummings. I'm currently a student at the James Madison University Percussion Studio, and today I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about table music by Thierry de Mey. We're just going to be diving a little bit into the history of the piece and the composer, as well as looking at the form of the work. So, table music is a piece for percussion trio and amplified wooden surfaces, the tables, right? Written by composer and filmmaker Thierry de Mey in 1987. The piece is really theatric in nature. It features the three performers arranged in a line facing the audience and uses really dramatic lighting to draw attention to the performers' hands, which perform a series of very intricately choreographed hand gestures. As such, the performers have to balance both the musical demands of the piece, the rhythms that they create by scraping and striking the table, and the visual demands, the series of hand gestures they have to perform. Because of this, table music positions itself somewhere between music and dance, which is a very common feature in many of de Mey's works. Thierry de Mey was born in 1956 in Brussels, Belgium. He was the son of a record company executive, so naturally both him and his younger sister, Michelle-Anne de Mey, both studied the arts from a very young age. Thierry took piano and percussion lessons, and Michelle studied dance. And both of them ended up taking these interests in arts into their professional lives. Thierry studied cinema at the IAD, or Institute of Broadcast Arts, in Belgium, and his sister, Michelle-Anne de Mey, studied at the Mudra School of Ballet in Brussels. For Thierry, studying cinema was a way of combining a lot of his childhood interests in music and in dance and in movement with the study of one interdisciplinary art. And I just want to take a second here to sort of highlight a distinction that Thierry makes between an interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary, as he puts it, art, and a multidisciplinary art. A multidisciplinary art being something like a large company, which might have different departments. You might have an R&D department, or an accounting department, or a marketing division that are each very skilled in their own fields and do whatever they need to within their own fields to make the company work. This is contrasted by an interdisciplinary art, which would be something like cinema, for instance. You draw from many different disciplines, from stuff like studio art, or theater, or dance, and also with new technologies, with different video cameras, or lighting, or CGI. And by drawing from all of these different disciplines and really focusing on the collaborative process and the way they sort of build off of each other, you end up with this whole that is much greater than the sum of the contributions of each of the individual parts. While at IAD, Thierry met Henry Van Leer, who was a prominent semiotician and professor at the school. Henry is best known for his book Anthropogeny, which is this grand study of humans and their history and evolution and all of their accomplishments, which is, needless to say, a pretty comprehensive work. But I would argue that his influence on Thierry and many of his other students at IAD is most felt through his development of different tools of semiotic analysis and different art forms. You can see here he wrote the book Philosophy of Photography, which was proved very influential in the field. Semiotics here being the study of signs and how we as humans communicate meaning. This really analytic approach on how meaning is expressed in different art forms gave Thierry an appreciation for the structure of works and for works based on larger forms or mathematical processes. Van Leer introduced Thierry to the music of Steve Reich, who was an American minimalist composer and had a very significant impact on Thierry. He remembers hitchhiking to see performances of several of Steve Reich's works, namely Drumming and Music for 18 Musicians, and he even collaborated with his sister and their childhood friend, Anna Teresa de Keersmaker, who was another Mudra student, to put together this ballet, Phase, which was based on 4 of Steve Reich's process-based works. The process here being phasing, which is a technique that Steve Reich uses pretty often, where you'll have two voices, right, each giving the same bit of repeated material. They'll start in unison, and then slowly one of the voices will either speed up or slow down, phasing out of sync with the other voice until eventually they realign. The ballet was really well received and sort of catapulted all three of their careers. In a New York Times interview, Steve Reich even went as far to say as, of all of the choreography done to my music, talking about phase, this was by far the best thing I'd seen, and that on an emotional and psychological level, I felt I really learned something about my own work. While at IAD, Thierry continued studying percussion performance and music composition privately through Fernand Sheeran, who was a percussionist and instructor at the Mudra School where Michel Anne studied. Sheeran had developed this sort of philosophy of rhythm and movement, or as he likes to put it, a study of rhythm as movement, which he extended to his work in all different areas. Thierry described this philosophy as an opposition between two poles characterized by the words he and boom. He refers to the beginning of a rhythmic moment, the arc it creates, a leap, difference, and individualization, and boom refers to the point of arrival, rest, and sameness. The focus on the tension between these two poles is meant to combat a feeling of uniformity and sameness that's created through constant repetition, as well as the loss of orientation to those two poles, which can be created through constant change. Sheeran's approach to rhythm, this refusal to consider rhythm as combinations of durations in space, served as a foil to a lot of Thierry's other influences. These contrasting aesthetics between the focus on the larger forms and mathematical processes and this sort of natural philosophy of rhythm as movement is something that served as guiding principles for many of Thierry's later works. According to Thierry, computation is good if it amplifies and plates the rhythmic curves, if it projects movements onto new topologies, but if it lets go of the curve, if it destroys the arc, it is bad. That is perhaps my only grid of values, the nerve of my writing, what decides what I keep or what I erase. This approach can be clearly seen in Thierry's self-described first real work, Roses Dance Roses, which was a collaboration between himself, his sister Michel Anne de Mey, their friend Anna Teresa de Keersmaker, and Belgian clarinetist and composer Peter Vermeersch. The work features a very strict mathematical formal structure, which is meant to create this sort of oppressive atmosphere. The form serves as an antagonist of sorts for the dancers, imposing speed, intense exertion, formal constraints, and immense repetition on them, with each action being repeated 77 times in very quick nature. The choreographic material, on the other hand, is very sensual in nature and features a lot of suggestive movements, which creates this tension between the cold, unrelenting formal structure and the physicality of the dancers. This tension serves as the narrative core of the work and results in the eventual glorification of the dancers' bodies as this sort of ultimate form of resistance against the formal machine. The work was very well received, seen as boundary pushing, and it received 2 Bessie Awards in 1987, which are some of the highest honors in modern dance, for choreography and lighting design. Here you can see a short clip of a film Thierry made for a revival of Roses Dance Roses, which features some of the original choreography and music from the ballet. Now, as you probably heard, Thierry and Peter's accompanying music is also largely based on repetition, drawing heavily from American minimalism. It features a small set of rhythmic and melodic ideas, which are then spun out into larger forms which match the structure of the choreography. Thierry, Peter, and the musicians who performed the music for Roses Dance for Roses went on to create the Maximalist, later renamed Ictus Ensemble, which became a sort of mainstay in the Belgian contemporary classical music scene. The group drew heavily from minimalism and procedural music. However, as their name suggests, they sought to sort of invert the associations that we typically have with minimalism as this quiet, contemplative aesthetic by including influences from rock, jazz, and punk music, as well as different instrumentations. 4 years later, Thierry and Peter worked together to create music for another stage ballet, this time a collaboration with first-time choreographer Wim van de Kiboes, called What the Body Does Not Remember. Wim was familiar with the dance world and had a short career in theater before working on the ballet, but he never went to a formal dance school. His fresh perspective and focus on natural movements are some of the things that really made the work stand out. It's largely based on instinct, when the body is forced to act without thinking. Wim saw many of the movements in ballet as being very beautiful, but lacking immediacy, so he sought to bring real, functional movement back to the stage. In the scene we're about to see, you'll see dancers throwing concrete bricks to each other up in the air on stage. And since the dancers' throws would be slightly different from performance to performance, they would have to constantly be reacting to the environment around them, creating the sense of immediacy that Wim sought to bring out. What the Body Does Not Remember also was seen as boundary pushing and very well received. It also got a Bessie Award for choreography in 1988. In another scene from What the Body Does Not Remember, a seated dancer rhythmically scrapes their hands on a wooden table, creating these large, sweeping motions which seemingly control the attraction and repulsion of two dancers. It was through the exploration of this choreography that Thierry de Mey developed table music. While working on the ballet, Thierry made a system of notating the movement of the dancers' hands, which he later developed into the system he used to notate table music. These efforts pushed Thierry to explore movement within music performance, something that we like to call gesture. Thierry described the impact of his table music system as the beginning of something. I was understanding how important movement inside music is. Movement is like the music of music. The pianist has to make movements inside the notes, and I think it is really important for all those people who want to play, sing, or do anything else. Obviously in dance, the movement is the purest, but it exists in every human thing. It is inside a film, everywhere, inside the actors. Thierry explored this approach to movement and music through a series of pieces which include table music, light music, and Silence Must Be, which he likes to call his music of gestures. Now let's come back to table music. Table music is a piece written for 3 percussionists, each of which use a small table as their only instrument. The performers create a variety of different sounds through different ways of striking or scraping the table with their hands, each of which are given a name and a symbol in the front of the score. The 3 musicians are seated in a line with equal spacing facing the audience, and are given a different name in the score for their position in the line. The left player, while facing the audience, is named Cour, the middle player, Milieu, and the right player, Jardin. Thierry instructs the performers. Table music is to be interpreted subtly and expressively, while giving particular care to the choreographic aspect. Avoid obscuring the hands or the score. And later, the lighting should enhance the surface of the table and the movement of the hands. The musicians are lit by reflection. Through the intricate detail included in the front of the score with the descriptions of each of the hand gestures, as well as the careful notes he gives for the staging of the percussionists, Thierry plays both the choreographer and the composer here, constructing a work which he calls both a piece for percussion as well as a short ballet of hands. The notation system Thierry created for table music, while taking many elements from more traditional Western notation, features a set of new ideas which may take some getting used to. Here we have a picture of a page of the score. Table music is metered, uses traditional symbols to show note lengths, and is written using 3 staves. These staves are labeled for the 3 performers, Cour, Milieu, and Jardin, for the left, middle, and right players, again while facing the audience. On each staff, notes for the left hand are shown at the bottom of the staff, and those played with the right hand are shown at the top of the staff. Thierry uses numerous different symbols and note heads, each of which describe a particular hand gesture, which he describes in the front of the score. For example, the sort of diamond-shaped note heads we see highlighted here represent le bord, or the side, which is performed by striking the table with the side of your index finger. Here we can see how Thierry describes that in the front of the score. And here we can see a short clip of this gesture in action. The rising or descending brackets, shown highlighted here, represent slice traces, or sliding, and is performed by touching your thumb to your index finger on both hands and placing all of your nails on the table. Then you slide your nails across the table. Again, since notes for the left hand are shown at the bottom of the staff and notes for the right are shown at the top, the upward bracket, shown first, would be interpreted as a slide from the left to the right, while a downward-facing bracket would be interpreted as a slide from the right to the left. In total, Thierry describes 21 unique gestures, some of which contain several variants on that gesture. Here we can see how Thierry describes those traces in the front of the score. And here we can see a short clip of the gesture in action. Moving on to the form, Thierry describes table music as being constructed similarly to a Baroque suite, which was a common early form of instrumental music writing. It consists of a number of contrasting Baroque dance pieces, preceded by a prelude. Thierry divides table music into 5 sections: the Overture, Fugato, Gallop, Rondo, and finally a short recapitulation and coda. Funnily enough, the Gallop is actually the only section which refers to a dance, so it seems like the comparison Thierry makes here to a Baroque suite is less about being a collection of dance pieces and more about having several distinct sections of music with their own formal logic, which use similar musical material. In this first section, or the Overture, Thierry introduces a lot of the compositional techniques and themes he uses throughout the piece. It starts with the middle player, or Milieu, giving us this theme made of long scraping sounds using the sliding gesture we just saw. Let's call that theme A. I've highlighted it in red on the score. These longer scraping rhythms are contrasted by an idea shown here, which uses the side gesture to make a theme using quicker rhythms and shorter sounds. Let's call that theme B. I've highlighted it in blue on the score here. Throughout this section, Thierry presents these two themes with different combinations of players. Sometimes one player will be playing theme A, while the other two use parts of theme B to play a sort of duo. Other times, those two players will be slightly offset, functioning more like two individuals rather than one cohesive unit. While other times, all three of them will be playing the rhythm in unison. By using these different combinations of players, Thierry creates a variety of rhythmic textures, which really livens up the piece. It's really useful in table music, because Thierry uses a small number of unique themes, much like his music for Roses Dance Roses. Much of the material is made using different combinations or augmentations of these themes, which results in a large amount of music created by a small amount of basic ideas. This is a common design philosophy with minimalist composers like Steve Reich, who Thierry drew a lot from in a lot of his works. We can see one of the techniques Thierry uses to stretch these ideas out in this first page with theme B. I've taken the time to notate it so we can view it easier here. Thierry takes the spaces in this theme and fills them in, creating a new rhythm from it, which he can use to call back to the original theme in a way, or he can present them both together to create a composite rhythm that is a rhythm played by two people but functions as one unit between the two players. Thierry calls this technique rhythmic borrowing. In the second half of the overture, Thierry introduces some of the techniques and rhythmic ideas which he features more prominently in the later sections. Here at measure 37, Thierry uses a canon between the right or left players, while milieu, or the middle player, has a more soloistic role. A canon, for those of you who might not be aware, is a technique in which two or more voices will play the same material but start slightly offset from each other. Here, the right or left players play parts of theme A, offset by this rest here. A sort of interesting thing to note here is that as these two players continue playing the canon, the interval that they're separated by slowly gets smaller and smaller until finally at measure 56 we see them playing this theme A material in unison. This process is really similar to the phasing process of Steve Reich, which we talked about earlier. Remember, two voices start by playing the same thing, and then one of them slowly phases out of sync from each other until they both realign. Now, while this is happening, sort of in between each of these canon ideas, we see bits and pieces of another theme, which is slowly developed and eventually shown here in full, played in unison by all three players in measure 67. We'll call this theme C. I've highlighted it in green in the score. And let's see a short clip of the three players playing this theme. Now, this theme is really important to the next section and is developed further in the Fugato. Now, the Fugato is the second of the 5 sections and means fugued or fugue-like. A fugue is a type of piece which was very popular in the Baroque period and uses similar techniques to the canon that we saw earlier. You'll have two or more voices enter offset from each other, each playing the same theme, which in a fugue we call the subject. There will be sections based off of statements of that subject in each of the voices, divided by sections of new material called episodes, which use contrasting themes. Now, fugues more or less follow a set of rules or structural expectations that determine when each voice enters, or how contrasting material is generated, or how each of the episodes are structured, that Thierry doesn't follow exactly here, which is probably why he called it a fugato. It's fugue-like. This section starts here in measure 90 with Jardine, the right player, when facing the audience, playing the subject, which we can see is largely based off of theme C from that first section. The two other voices enter one after the other, starting with a choreographed page turn and continuing with a statement of the subject. You'll notice that here in measure 97, when Jardine finishes the subject, and again in measure 100 when Milou finishes, that the players use contrasting material to fill in some of the spaces left while the other voices finish their statements of the subject. This material fills a similar role to a counter subject in a fugue, which is a secondary theme which often complements the subject. We'll call this theme D. I've taken the time to highlight it in purple in the score above me. And now let's watch a short clip of the beginning of this Fugato section, so we can get both of those themes, the subject, theme C, and the counter subject, theme D, in our ears. After each player finishes their statement of the subject, we get a section which is largely based on our counter subject of sorts, and functions similarly to an episode in a fugue. You can also see in measure 103, and with the solo part that Core plays here, that the material that isn't drawn from theme D is based around theme B, or its rhythmically borrowed theme from the first section. The rest of the Fugato follows a similar formula, with each voice again entering with the theme C subject and another episode using theme D material. One thing that Thierry does here, which would be pretty unusual in a fugue, is ending the fugue with an episode. Normally in a fugue, the closing material would be largely based around the subject, which at this point would feel very familiar and very settled. I would assume that here, since the end of this section is a high point energy-wise in the piece, that Thierry chose to focus more on theme D since it's more rhythmically active and more exciting than theme C. It's a lot faster. So it would fit the natural arc of the piece better. If you remember Thierry's lessons with Fernand Sheeran, this was one of the main points. After the Fugato, we get the Gallop, which, funnily enough, is the only section in table music which is based off of a dance. So, the Gallop, or Gallopade, was a dance in which pairs of dancers would arrange themselves in a large circle and follow each other around the room, using a step which mimics the galloping of a horse. You can see an example of that here. We can see the influence of the Gallopade primarily in this gesture outlined here, which I've highlighted in yellow, in measure 140. This figure creates a sort of bouncing motion between the fingertips and the wrist, which mimics the galloping step of the dance. Another interesting thing about this section, when Thierry uses different combinations of players to create different textures, like he did in the earlier sections, it sort of moves the galloping motion around the trio, similarly to how the couples followed each other around the room. This galloping motion is contrasted by fragments of this theme shown in full here at the beginning of the section, which I've highlighted in green. You might recognize this as theme C, as it was stated in the end of the first section. Now let's move on to the rondo. Typically, rondo would refer to a musical form which has some repeated theme, let's call that A, which is divided by contrasting themes that could repeat or vary like so. In table music, this rondo section is fairly short. It's only 18 measures long, and it really doesn't follow that same formal logic. Instead, it seems to be structured around the compositional techniques that Thierry used in the earlier sections, mainly using different combinations of players to create different textures, having players phase in and out of sync with each other, and the rhythmic borrowing technique, which we've seen Thierry use to create composite rhythms. Since this section is so short, I think we should just take the time now to watch it in full so we can talk about it a little bit more later. This section starts with all three players giving these large sweeping motions, which Thierry calls les circles, or the circles. It's the slowest thing that's happened in a while and serves as a good low energy point for Thierry to build upon. After this, we see Jardine speed up a little bit, getting out of sync with the other two players. And now that Thierry has divided the trio into a duo and a single player, he uses Jardine to fill in the spaces of the rhythms of the other two players. After this, the middle player and eventually Cour speed up to join Jardine, and they form these larger unison motions. This section is a little bit different from the others we've seen so far, in that the time is much freer. Instead of the shorter tapping or striking gestures, we have these large sweeping motions. The section also has less of a consistent meter, which can further muddy the sense of time. I think that this section functions similarly to the end of a development section in a sonata form. Basically, you have these themes which Thierry presented in the first section. You can think of those as home. They should be pretty familiar at this point in the piece. These themes are developed and changed in the later sections, and we move farther away from our home base, as it were. And at this point, we're at our most uncertain, the farthest point away from the original themes, and it creates this sort of tension, right? We're not quite sure how we're going to get back. And this sense of uncertainty really makes the eventual return to the more familiar themes in the next section, the recapitulation, much more rewarding. So, the recapitulation is the last of the five sections, and it starts with this rhythmically exciting material, which we first saw in the first section at measure 58, which I've highlighted in yellow, and continues on to another section using theme C material, which I've outlined in green. It's important to note here that throughout all of this ending section, all three players essentially function as one unit. They primarily play unison rhythms, aside from short sections where Thierry divides the faster, more rhythmically active material between the players, like I've highlighted in purple. By giving us these themes, which we've seen in all of the previous sections, without the techniques that he used to develop them, right? Without giving us different themes and different players to create rhythmic textures, or without giving us themes but the players are offset in canon, right? These unison themes really help the section feel much more settled. And towards the end of the section, when we get the larger sweeping motions from the rondo, which were previously disorienting, this time they're presented in unison at a faster tempo with a much more apparent meter, which resolves the conflict that they created earlier. This time we know how to get home. And now that the conflict is resolved, Thierry ends the piece with a short coda using themes from the first section. Let's just take a moment now and look at the ending of the recapitulation, which uses the rondo theme and the short coda. Table music provides us with a unique look at the beginnings of Thierry's exploration of gesture and movement within music, while incorporating elements from his diverse background and interests. Through the use of more common musical themes, forms, and compositional techniques, there are aspects which should be familiar to those of us who are more familiar with Western classical music, while his focus on the natural rhythmic arcs of the piece and groove really help keep it approachable and engaging for an audience at large. Additionally, the focus on the choreographic and theatric elements, which draw on Thierry's own experience in dance and cinematography, really create a unique experience to the concert hall. Table music has something for everyone to enjoy, and I really hope that my brief orientation to this piece and to the composer can enhance your own enjoyment of it. I want to thank you all for sticking around through this program notes lecture, and I hope you can enjoy our performance of Table Music by Thierry de Mey.